Putin's helicopter was caught in this Ukrainian drone attack. And we just touched on it briefly. You said that you think that, it's possible that it was just an accident, that Putin happened to be there at the time where this drone attack was going on. We haven't heard much in mainstream media or really many people talk about this incident. But it is a major thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how close was Putin to actually being assassinated, or having this helicopter being taken down? Was he the target? Do you still
Mhm.
believe that it was an accident, or was this an assassination attempt?
The Russians themselves are not claiming that it was an assassination attempt. That's important. I haven't heard any sort of official statement to that effect. Um, they acknowledge that it's happened, but they just left it there. Now, it's possible that it was an assassination attempt. The Russians know that it was an assassination attempt, and they have chosen to play it down because they know that the pressure to escalate would just be huge in that case. So that is possible. I'm not going to put a percentage figure on it, but it's very much within the realm of possibility that that's what's going on. Now, a lot of people was kind of talking about it as like especially within, let's say, dissident or pro-Russian media have been talking about it as though it were an established fact, and that clearly it wasn't. And you say, well, it's a coincidence, and some people say, well, I don't believe in coincidences. I've heard that. Well, if you don't believe in coincidences, you don't believe in chance, because a coincidence just happens to be, it can. Let's say you have a string of numbers, and if you get two 100s, one after another, well, that's going to happen occasionally in a string of numbers. I'm just kind of like mathematically expressing a coincidence. It's, 1 in 100 chance that you'll get two of them, two numbers like that in a row. And to say that it can't happen, that there can't be coincidences, is to say that you really don't believe in chance. Clearly, there are, much of human affairs is certainly affected by chance. It's part of the reality of the world that we live in. And now you say, well, how much of a chance was this? How much of a coincidence was it? Rather, if it's a really extreme coincidence, then you should be very, very suspicious and maybe discount it. But look, over the last several days, and certainly at the time that Putin was in that helicopter, the Ukrainians have been sending in, fleets of drones, hundreds, over the course of several days, thousands of drones. And many of them have gone into the Kursk region. So that just the fact that his helicopter would actually encounter one of these waves of drones doesn't seem to me such an unusual occurrence. I think that maybe the bigger question should be, and I think some of the Russians themselves has raised this, is like, why was he flying in a helicopter there? Given the current state of affairs and the number of drone attacks, it was really a much too risky a thing to do. So I still lean, towards just an accident. It was just it was kind of it was a helicopter flight that probably shouldn't have. It was too risky, but they did it, and they did encounter these drones. But these drones hadn't been sent to actually to take the helicopter down. Now I acknowledge, I may be wrong. Maybe this was planned, and if it was planned, then that if indeed it was an attempted assassination, then we are looking at something very frightening, because I think everybody agrees that the intelligence to do something like that would have to be supplied by a Western source, and that would suggest, if in fact that this was intentional, that there was at least, someone, an agency or within the West that was attempting to assassinate Putin. And that's a frightening thought. I can't say that that's not true. It may be, in fact, it was, because, again, I don't think the Ukrainians could have done this on their own. Now, that would just show just a breathtaking recklessness and really stupidity, because in spite of what everybody or so many Western commentators say, Putin is very cautious. He's very moderate. He really is looking, I believe very strongly that he's always looking for a negotiated settlement. He would prefer to do that than to prosecute the war. But anybody who might replace him, and especially following an assassination when there would be just fury throughout Russia, would come down, with just a mailed fist. The restraint that the Russians have shown so far would end, and you would see, probably large parts of Kiev would just be completely leveled. I mean, I think we would just see the Russians express their fury in military terms, and they would see behaving like actually the Americans have in places like Iraq and so on. I think there's a real chance of that. And so if in fact this was intentional, that's almost shows sort of like just some sort of nihilistic recklessness on the part of, whatever agency or government was involved in it.
Well, that's pretty par for the course for the West, right? Stupidity and nihilistic recklessness. I mean, the thing is, okay, I understand there's been lots of drones being launched into Russia, but I mean, we're talking about a massive border, like there's a lot of territory. The chance of just coming across one to me seems a bit slim. Also, just the timing, right? I mean, like, I don't know. I feel like there's more to the story than people are letting on. And also, if you're flying these drones, I don't know if these are FPV drones. I mean, is somebody sitting there and then you see a helicopter? And you're like, Putin? What's going on? It's just like, why wouldn't they? I mean, I wish there was more details on it, like how close did these drones get? How many were there? Were they all taken down for electronic warfare? Were they actually heading towards the helicopter, or was their flight path sort of predestined and it just happened to go right past? Like,
exactly. I mean, if you had those details, then I think you could answer the question. I mean, if it just turned out that there was maybe a wave of drones, 50 of them, and they were heading, let's say, northwest, and his helicopter was coming from the northeast or something, and they just intersected, and then the Russian AD took down the drones that were in the vicinity of the helicopter, and he went on, and then other drones continued to the northwest or something. That would tell you that it was just a chance meeting in the skies. But if you could see them, if they in fact were converging on this helicopter, that would certainly, it would more than suggest, would pretty much prove that it was intentional. I know it may be unintentional. It's just such but I think we can't jump to conclusions. It could be,
it's
just
fun.
Yeah, I know.
It's fun to jump.
I'm open to it. But so like if evidence, I'm not saying that I know for sure, I'm confident that this was just a chance meeting in the skies. But I find it believable. That's what the Russian government is saying. But if further information is released, that does support the assassination theory, then I could be very easily persuaded that it was an assassination, and that would have very troubling consequences. I mean, just meaning that, maybe I have a naive faith in some sort of sanity among military planners. I know that it is naive, but they have, for example, I think, I don't know. They've at least have in the past have tried to distance themselves from like assassination attempts by the Ukrainians. Maybe that's just completely phony, but they have expressed criticism of, let's say, Ukrainian recklessness in the past through leaks to the New York Times, for example. And maybe that's just all kind of a cover for their own involvement. I admit that's a possibility. I'd like to think that there is still some sanity and they are trying to exercise some kind of restraint.
I think
maybe I'm wrong.
I think there's a good chance that the military industrial complex, the Pentagon, everything is so large and there's different sects and it's becoming fractured that there might be certain elements within the MIC that are just moving with their own agenda that has just so much momentum and inertia that it just doesn't stop. and Trump isn't really aware of it. There isn't really a single person in charge. It feels like maybe that there
Yeah.
are parts that are just like, okay, yeah, this is what we're doing. We don't need approval for this. And, we saw in Trump's first term as well, the generals just straight lied to him about, moving troops out of Syria or
Right.
whatever it is. So, that could be what's going on, is that there's just, there are people within the US or Western NATO military industrial complex that are like in the mode that we are at war with Russia. We are commanding this war. We got to do these things. And, that's our role. We're doing that. They're not listening to the politicians or people back in the States. They could be operating out of the German headquarters, whatever, and they're just piloting it. And then, do you think that's likely?
Well, yeah, it certainly could be, rogue elements, a rogue department. And it has to be said that we've just seen a great deal of chaos under Trump. He doesn't run a tight ship, as we said many times. And so it is possible. It certainly
Right.
is. I think even under a president that does, keep tighter control of things, there is always a possibility of some individuals or small group going rogue. I think I think that's always a possibility within, for example, intelligence agencies.
Right. Yeah, I just have a feeling there's this massive competing factions now. It's just a complete mess, and who knows who's in charge, who's making what decisions, who has what power of lever that they're holding to approve something. Well, you touched on this briefly, but what if Putin was assassinated? What would happen? If this would be a horrific escalation, right? And we would probably see somebody come into power in Russia that will, take the gloves off completely, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Again, it's silly. I've been hearing this for years. It's just like the problem is Putin. We got to get rid of him, and then somehow, he's the mad dictator. If we eliminate him somehow, or if he's overthrown, then the sane people will take power who will want to make peace with the West. That's been the story for years, even prior to the SMO, years prior to the SMO. And it's always been stupid. It's just, you observe him, everything about Putin, everything that he does is done very carefully. It's actually, he's reluctant to to employ harsh measures. He avoids risky measures. He's really the epitome of caution and reason. And within the country, it's not that there is this growing criticism of Putin, from the, let's say, the peaceniks in the country. That's not where the pressure is being placed on the administration. It's quite the opposite. There's this growing impatience, with the degree to which Putin and his government has been accommodating to the West, the degree to which they have been restrained, the degree to which they've been cautious. And there are a lot of people, I think, probably, represented best by Medvedev, who, could very well be the man who would take over, let's say, if Putin were assassinated. Yeah, there's just no question that, even absent, let's say, an assassination, let's say if just Putin died or stepped down, for entirely, let's say, not because of any sort of action, not because of any assassination attempt or an assassination, but he simply stepped down or he passed away, something like this. I think there's no question that whoever took power would be, or I can't say no question, but almost certainly would be just a more hardline and would pursue the war with greater vigor and with less caution. But if there was an assassination, there would be real fury. That's something that this would, just throughout the country, the people, the government, and there would be cries for revenge. And I think that that's what we would see. We would just see the Russians take their gloves off. And yeah,
But
maybe
that's
you can actually argue that with, like, there are nationalists or nationalist leaning people within Russia who have said that that's what should have been done long ago, and that actually there would be less bloodshed in the long run if we didn't go through this so carefully. Yeah, in the short run, there would be more bloodshed. We'd lose more lives, more Russian lives, as well as Ukrainian lives. But that would bring the war to a speedier conclusion, and that this is what should have been done a while ago. I know there are people that argue that in Russia, and they would certainly, if Putin were out of the picture, those are the people who would take charge. And that's what you would see happen.
Yeah, well, I think people like Zelensky and many Western politicians probably want to see this happen. They are probably frustrated with Putin that they keep on doing provocations and escalations, and he's not responding sort of emotionally. He's been very measured with everything and hasn't fallen for these ploys. So I think that is what Zelensky and I think many Western leaders want, right? They want Russia to take the gloves off, so to speak, because then it can, help them drum up war fever and push the narrative of this unhinged Russian aggression that is endangering all of Europe.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that may be, again, I think that's probably the way that Putin looks at it. He says that, okay, I have to proceed, in this rather cautious manner because I don't want to provoke a response. I don't want to draw in NATO. And that, of course, is Zelensky is probably understanding now that that's his only hope. Just like, again, not Netanyahu in Israel. I got to draw on the Americans in a war against Iran. Zelensky, I got to draw on the Americans, or NATO to fight Russia. That's the only way that my regime is going to be saved. Now, we really don't know what would happen. I mean, I think I was listening to, I guess it was Jim Jotras, who was formerly in the U.S. State Department and follows Russian affairs very, very closely. And he's in favor of, let's say, the more nationalist approach. And he says in the end, fewer people are going to die. But he also acknowledges that there is a risk. There is a risk that it will provoke the West in some significant way, and it could bring in, NATO troops and expand the conflict. And, who knows? It's anybody's guess, really, what will happen. If the Russians come down, real hard, and they unleash the full force of their military on Ukraine, it might also it might be like a bucket of cold water for the West. You were talking about how they just don't seem to understand to respect or fear the Russians. Maybe at that point they would, and they maybe actually, you would hope that would be the point where they sober up and say, oh, wait a second. We've just got to negotiate. There's just no way, we're going to get the same treatment if we go onto that battlefield. But again, dealing with these people, they haven't shown a rational response so far. And so, maybe we're being very naive to assume that they'll respond rationally to a sudden Russian escalation. It may be that they do actually respond by sending their own troops, and we would have an expansion of the war.
Do you know the sentiment of most Europeans, NATO members, European countries, what their sentiment is towards the Ukraine war? Is there any support for an actual war with Russia within these countries? Do you think that's a risk? I mean, obviously that's kind of what Merz and Macron, Starmer are trying to drum that up, try to get people like, we need to go to war with Russia. Let's give them everything we can, potentially get it. But there doesn't seem to be that drive. Do you think that's a possibility, though, in this war? I just don't see it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, support for Ukraine has been fading throughout Europe from, ever since February 2022. That was really the high point when the SMO was launched back then. And it was high during the first year, but ever since it's been declining. And in general, these governments are really out of sync with their people. The support for the war is much stronger within the governments than it is within the people. They're not responding in any way to grassroots pressure. I think probably the only countries where you find some kind of, real popular support for increased involvement and I'm not even sure about that, but maybe in the Baltics and in Poland. But in general, no. There's no interest in increased involvement. There's no support for the ideas of sending troops. I think that's very strongly opposed in places like France and Germany and the UK. Now, if there was a sudden escalation, and would there be? Because you never know. Sometimes an incident can cause mass psychology to flip. Suddenly. If there's some sort of casus belli. But the thing is, if Russia were to escalate suddenly against Ukraine, I still don't see how that would provoke, a very popular, an emotional response among the European, the Europeans in general, especially if it's in response to an assassination. Because I think people understand, like, if our chancellor were assassinated, or a president or a prime minister, if he was assassinated, we would respond maybe in a similar way. It's hard to, I think it would be hard to fault the Russians and to claim that it was what they were doing was a threat to Europe. It would be an understandable response to, to a very, beyond a provocation, an act of war against, an attack on the leader of a country. So I don't see it. Yeah, that's the thing about, again, you get all this tough about the Europeans in general and the European leaders. So you get a lot of tough talk from them, but I don't think they don't have any sort of firm foundation, no firm popular foundation. And I don't see that changing in a significant way. And as time goes on, it seems like that the opposition is only going to grow as European economies deteriorate, as the hopelessness of the Ukrainian cause becomes, more and more apparent. I think all of those, both of those trends are going to actually weaken support for Ukraine. And even if if we should see as an assassination and a very forceful response by Russia, I don't think that's going to change those trends at all.